Our opening reading is from a book called Out of the Ordinary Meditations by Gordon B. McKeeman. It's called A Drop in the Bucket. What it says about inadequacy, futility, insignificance, a drop in a bucket. What's the sense? What's the use? We're no longer in the center of things. Copernicus removed the Earth from the center of the solar system. Darwin removed humans from the center of the Earth. Astronomy has moved the solar system from the center of the universe. Well, who are we then? And where are we? Physiologists call us weak, watery solutions, more or less jellified. Just suppose that we are the merest drops in a bucket. There are unspoken assumptions here. We assume that a full bucket is what we're aiming at. And until that bucket is full, nothing has been accomplished. There's no shortage of buckets. The empty bucket litany is long and tedious. Racism, sexism, ableism, authoritarianism, oppression, injustice, violence, environmental degradation, overpopulation. You feel like a drop in a bucket? Who asked you to fill the bucket, especially all alone? Remember how many there are who share your concern. We may feel daunted, but we are not one drop. A sense of isolation is inherent of the drop in the bucket feeling. Sometimes one can decide the size of the bucket. Don't think you can do a large bucket? Try a smaller one. Even imparting a bit of hope, a pat on the back, a financial contribution, a few hours of volunteer service, every drop helps. It might even be wise to remember why you need to help fill this bucket. Possibly to quench the thirst of someone who is hard at work on a larger one. Remember that buckets of whatever size are filled a drop at a time. If you don't help, it will take even longer. Your drop may be one of the last drops needed. Why is it that our image is of the first drop in the bucket? Where we'd be if everybody gave up putting drops in the bucket, probably much worse off. Persistence depends on patience, on keeping at it when there is little to reassure us. It would be too bad to give up, sit back, bemoan the sorrow, and wonder why somebody, anybody, everybody, not me, thank you, doesn't do something about it. After all, the Grand Canyon was fashioned by drops of water, as ordinary as they seem. Today's the second part of a three-part sermon series dedicated to Reverend Dr. Forrest Church. They were written and originally presented by Reverend Peter Friedrichs of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Delaware County, Pennsylvania. As I noted last time I spoke here, Forrest Church spent nearly 30 years as the senior minister of All Souls, Unitarian Universalist Church in New York City, and a man I personally knew. He was a public theologian who authored 20 books in his lifetime and was a frequent commentator in the public media. After being diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus, he sat down to write what he thought would be his last book, and the result was Love and Death, My Journey Through the Valley of the Shadow. Forrest Church succumbed to his disease in September 2009 shortly before publication of his final work entitled The Cathedral of the World, a Universalist Theology. 10 years earlier, Forrest Church acknowledged that he was addicted to alcohol, and he joined AA. As part of his recovery, he developed a mantra that he said served him well for the remaining years of his life. It consists of 3 statements. Want what you have, do what you can, be who you are. Last time we examined the statement, want what you have. This week, I'd like to offer you reflections on do what you can. Do what you can. This part of Dr. Church's mantra, he tells us, focuses our minds on what is possible. No more, no less, thereby filling each moment with conscious, practicable endeavor. In the simple statement, Dr. Church is at once acknowledging that we have power and control over our destiny, while he is also acquiescing to the limitations and boundaries that we experience as human beings. He's orienting us toward the feasible and the achievable, knowing full well that as individuals we are limited in our reach and our scope. In one of the closing chapters of Love and Death, Church bemoans how much wasted energy we spend trying to do what we can't, and how often we fail to optimize our efforts and thereby achieve the significant goals that do lie within our power. He goes on to tell us that when we quit trying because we fail to achieve our pipe dreams, we overlook all we actually could accomplish by putting our shoulder squarely to the right wheel. When Church instructs us to do what you can, he's calling us to let go of dreams of grandiosity and to focus on the meaningful accomplishments we can achieve within the context of our everyday lives. The statement is reminiscent of a reading found in our hymnal, written by Unitarian minister Edward Everett Hale more than a century ago. I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something I can do. While I was reflecting on this simple statement, do what you can, my mind went back to the spring of 1989. The once monolithic Soviet bloc had begun to disintegrate. The Berlin Wall had begun to crumble. Students and other pro-democracy forces in China seized what they perceived to be an opportunity to pressure their government to loosen its iron grip on its people. And protesters flooded the streets of its capital, Beijing. The Chinese government, as you may recall, acted swiftly and violently to crush the peaceful protests, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, were killed. And if you're like me, there is one image from the Tiananmen Square protest that is burned indelibly into your brain, one of the few images that survives from that time and place. It is the image of Tank Man. We call him Tank Man because his identity has never been known, at least to the Western world. In the video that was smuggled out of the country, we see a column of Chinese tanks rumbling down a street in central Beijing. And we see a lone man carrying what appear to be shopping bags step off the sidewalk and into the path of the oncoming tanks. Instead of mowing him down, as they easily could, the column comes to an abrupt halt in front of him. Tank Man stands stock still in front of the lead tank, and the tank sits there, idling. Then the lead tank tries to maneuver around the man. Each time it does, Tank Man moves sideways to block the tank's progress. Finally, the tank driver gives up, shuts down his engine. The two are at a standoff. This is the iconic image. A lone man standing up for human rights, staring into the barrel of the tank's gun, holding it at bay. And eventually, members of the secret police arrived and removed Tank Man from the scene, and the tanks proceeded on their mission of death and destruction. But Tank Man left his mark. Now we know, of course, that Tank Man did not bring down the Communist Party apparatus. We know that the Chinese government suppressed the student protests with overwhelming force and violence. And we also know that China remains one of the most oppressive countries on the face of the planet, severely limiting many of the freedoms that we here take for granted. And while we don't know for sure, we suspect that Tank Man paid for his actions with his life. I have no idea what triggered Tank Man to step off that curb to stand his ground that day, but in one stark and startling moment, he did what he could. And for a few brief moments, it seems, one man had stopped the oppressive Chinese regime dead in its tracks. In the previous sermon, I mentioned the Marianne Williamson quote that has over the years been attributed to Nelson Mandela. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. That statement's highly inspirational, and I think it speaks a truth, but it's not entirely true. It is in some ways a statement more about the limits of our imaginations and self-perceptions than it is a statement about the extent of our power. The truth is that most of us are not like Tank Man. The truth is that the effort most of us make is going to be of the drop in the bucket variety. But as you heard in today's reading, that drop just might really matter. Gordon McKeeman warns us against the unspoken assumptions of the drop in the bucket mentality. We assume that a full bucket is what we're aiming for, and that until the bucket is full, nothing has been accomplished. And I love that question that hits us right between the eyes. Why is it that our image is of the first drop in the bucket? The implication being that our drop may be the last drop, the one more drop that fills the bucket. In his book, The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell talks about how little things can make a big difference. Using viruses as a model for explaining social change, he tells us that a small change in behavior can alter the course of society. He writes that we are, as humans, heavily socialized to make a kind of rough approximation between cause and effect. Viruses and epidemics, both medical and social, do not work this way. In fact, he goes on, oftentimes the effect of a seemingly small cause can be huge. To appreciate the power of epidemics, he writes, we have to abandon this expectation of proportionality. We need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that sometimes big changes follow from small events, and sometimes these changes can happen very quickly. He encourages us to consider how we might start our own positive social epidemics. The tipping point theory is dramatically demonstrated by the story of the 100th monkey. While not verified scientifically, the story is at least illuminating as a parable. Back in the 1950s, scientists were studying the behavior of a certain type of monkey on an isolated island off Japan. They noticed that most monkeys would eat the staple of their diet, sweet potatoes, fresh out of the ground. But then they noticed that one monkey took a sweet potato down to the nearby shore and washed it in the water. Other monkeys on the island, watching this behavior, soon began to copy it. More and more monkeys began to wash their meals before eating them. And then something amazing happened. As we are told, Once a critical mass of monkeys on this island was washing its sweet potatoes, the so-called 100th monkey, this same behavior began to occur in monkey populations on other nearby islands unconnected to the first colony. When a tipping point was reached, there was somehow communicated to the other monkey colonies the message, wash your sweet potatoes. And they did this without Facebook. The point of all this is to say that by doing what we can, we're doing one thing for certain and possibly another. First and for certain, we are having a local and immediate impact. Whether it is making sure that a homeless family has a roof over its head and meals to eat when we volunteer for the Interfaith Hospitality Network, or whether it's writing a letter to our representatives in Tallahassee to advocate for reasonable gun control measures. Those actions have immediate effects and consequences. Secondly, and perhaps less certainly, when we do what we can, we are adding our drop to a bucket that may be nearly full, that may be balanced on its edge and near the tipping point. We may be that 100th monkey whose action sparks the epidemic of social change. With all that being said, I ask you to notice that Dr. Church's phrase, do what you can, has a Buddhist ring to it. It does not concern itself with consequences, and it asks us to release ourselves from attachment to outcomes. Do what you can. A simple imperative to act within the scope of our ability. Don't worry about the impact. That will take care of itself. While Forrest was eminently practical in his approach to life, he accepted that life is ultimately a profound mystery, and that the impact of our lives cannot be known. In their work, How Can I Help?, Ram Dass and Paul Gorman tell us that service is ultimately a journey into the unknown. If we obsess over the effect of our actions, whether we're the first monkey or the 100th, the last drop in the bucket or the first, we may, because of the apparent futility, choose simply never to act at all. Dass and Gorman tell us that we have a choice to make. We can either be frustrated and worn out by uncertainty and doubt, they write, or try to find a way to open to the ambiguity. Embrace it. Work with it. Be moved and inspired by it. And thereby come closer to the very heart of service where true freedom is found. This letting go of outcomes is embedded in Forrest Church's simple statement. And it rings true to the statement of Jesus when, after telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, he instructed the lawyer simply to go and do likewise. Ram Dass says, we give it all we have and trust the rest to God, to nature, to the universe. We do everything we can to relieve someone's suffering, but we are willing to surrender attachment to how we want things to be. On that bright blue day in June of 1989, in a stunning act of courage, Tank Man did what he could. He stood. He simply stood. He stood in front of a column of tanks preventing their passage, at least for a time. I doubt he thought he was going to bring the Chinese government to its knees. I doubt even that he thought the tanks were going to stop. But he did what he could do. He stood for freedom. He stood for justice. He stood for the oppressed people of his country. Let the image of this one courageous soul stand as the inspiration to us as we heed Forrest Church's call to do what you can. Go and do likewise. Amen, and blessed be. Forrest Church has some closing words. Life is not a given, but a wondrous gift. That gift comes with a price attached. One day something will steal it from us. That doesn't diminish our lives. It increases their value. Fragility and impermanence ensure life's preciousness.